Welcome back to our channel World of Royals, where we share updates and untold stories about Catherine, Princess of Wales, and her royal family. Today, we bring you some news.
It is absolute chaos behind the gates of Montecito tonight, and Meghan Markle and Prince Harry are reportedly watching the foundation of their post-royal world crack in real time. What was once marketed as a bold reinvention now looks increasingly like a slow-motion collapse. The news landed quietly, almost stealthily, during the lull between Christmas and New Year, a window long favored by crisis managers hoping bad headlines slip past unnoticed. But this story refused to stay buried. Instead, it detonated. James Holt, the executive director of Archewell, and one of the very few figures who has stood beside the Sussexes from the beginning, has confirmed his departure, and this is not the kind of exit that can be brushed off as routine. This is the loss of an insider, a loyalist, a man who helped carry their vision across continents. Holt was not a late hire or a short-term fixer. He appeared in their Netflix documentary, relocated his family from the United Kingdom to California, and remained in place through every controversy, every public backlash, and every faltering venture. When someone with that level of proximity and endurance suddenly walks away, it sends a message that no amount of polished statements can disguise. And the damage does not stop there. Holt is only the most visible domino to fall. Just days earlier, their head of public relations quietly exited after less than a year on the job, a shockingly brief tenure for a senior communications role. On top of that, reports indicate that additional Archewell staff members were let go as part of what has been carefully described as a new operating model. Strip away the corporate phrasing, and what remains is far less flattering. This is not refinement. This is contraction. This is an organization being hollowed out. Sources close to the situation have described the atmosphere in stark terms, with one insider calling it a self-inflicted disaster, and another noting that mass departures rarely signal anything other than deep internal dysfunction. Healthy organizations do not bleed talent at this rate. Strategic pivots do not leave offices empty. The timing only deepens the mystery. Releasing this news during a period of reduced media scrutiny was clearly intended to minimize fallout, yet it has had the opposite effect. Instead of fading into the background, the staff exodus has become the headline. Observers across royal, celebrity, and non-profit circles are now asking the same uncomfortable question. What exactly is going on behind closed doors in Montecito? Archewell was meant to symbolize independence, purpose, and a clean break from the royal system. Instead, it is now rumored to be operating with a skeletal team, a stunning reversal for a foundation launched with such ambition and fanfare. One or two remaining employees cannot sustain a global vision. And as troubling as these revelations already are, they represent only the opening chapter. Because if this many people are leaving all at once, the reasons behind it may be far more explosive than anyone has yet admitted. What insiders are now revealing about why so many people are abandoning Archewell has sent shockwaves through royal and entertainment circles alike. When James Holt's carefully worded departure statement appeared, it read less like a farewell and more like a hostage note disguised as gratitude. Every sentence overflowed with praise, every paragraph polished to a glossy sheen, as if the goal were not to inform but to reassure. Yet for those who have spent years watching the Sussex operation from the inside, the message landed very differently. Industry veterans immediately began dissecting the language, searching not for what was said, but for what was conspicuously missing. And what they found was deeply unsettling. In the statement, Holt described his years with the Sussexes in almost poetic terms, referencing early projects with Prince Harry dating back nearly a decade and emphasizing lofty humanitarian ideals. He painted a picture of inspiration, of vision, of boundless encouragement to think bigger about global impact. Meghan was described as warm, intuitive, and deeply connected to people from all walks of life. On paper, it sounded idyllic. But according to multiple former Archewell employees, the glowing portrayal bore little resemblance to the reality behind closed doors. One insider remarked that the Harry described in the statement was a stranger to anyone who had actually worked with him day to day. Another was more blunt, suggesting that the inspirational figure presented publicly rarely appeared in internal meetings at all. The timing of Holt's exit only intensified speculation. After years of loyalty, relocation, and unwavering public support, why leave now? Why uproot again after building an entire life around the Sussex enterprise? While the official explanation centered on family priorities and a return to London, sources close to the situation say those reasons barely scratch the surface. According to individuals familiar with the internal dynamics, working conditions had grown increasingly volatile. Projects were launched with fanfare and then abandoned without explanation. Priorities shifted overnight. Expectations expanded while resources shrank. One former associate likened the environment to a pressure chamber where stress steadily increased, but acknowledgement of the problem was forbidden. What makes Holt's departure especially damaging is not simply his role, but what he symbolized. He was not an expendable hire or a short-term consultant. He was the institutional memory, the steady presence who bridged royal life and California ambition. When someone that's central steps away, it sends a signal louder than any press release. Observers also noted a curious detail buried in his statement. Holt would continue advising on select humanitarian initiatives. To some, this sounded like an olive branch. To others, it read as a calculated attempt to maintain distance while preserving appearances. The Sussexes' own response did little to quiet speculation. Their message was polite, brief, and noticeably impersonal. Praise was offered, titles were adjusted, and the relationship was reframed in abstract terms. But the subtext was unmistakable. Another pillar of the operation had quietly fallen away, and Holt was only the beginning. If James Holt's departure rattled observers, the exit of their head of communications sent tremors through the entire operation. Meredith's tenure lasted barely 7 months, an astonishingly short span for someone brought in to stabilize one of the most scrutinized public brands on the planet. This was not a junior hire learning on the job. She was widely regarded as a seasoned professional, known for her discretion, resilience, and ability to navigate hostile media environments. And yet even she walked away. Industry insiders describe her exit as less surprising than inevitable. From the moment she stepped into the role, she inherited a crisis machine already running at full speed. Each week brought a new controversy, a new misstep, or a new narrative to extinguish. According to sources, professional advice was frequently ignored or overridden, often at the last minute. Strategies painstakingly developed were scrapped on impulse. Messaging shifted without warning. For a communications expert tasked with restoring credibility, the situation bordered on impossible. Reports suggest the breaking point came during what has since been dubbed Photogate. Attendance at a high-profile holiday gathering should have been a routine optics win. Instead, it reportedly devolved into a behind-the-scenes scramble after photographs surfaced online. Sources claim demands were made to have images removed, placing Meredith in an awkward position with some of the most influential figures in entertainment. For someone attempting to rebuild strained Hollywood relationships, watching bridges burn in real time proved untenable. But Photogate was merely the final straw. Meredith had already weathered multiple storms. There was the fallout from a televised interview that critics described as petulant and ill-advised. There were viral moments that inspired ridicule rather than sympathy. Through it all, insiders say her counsel was often dismissed. When a brand refuses to listen to its own crisis manager, collapse becomes a matter of time. The contrast between departure statements was telling. The Sussexes released a terse announcement acknowledging the conclusion of professional services. No elaboration, no warmth. Meredith's own message, by contrast, emphasized gratitude, respect, and forward momentum. Public relations professionals immediately recognized the pattern. When the departing employee sounds more gracious than the employer, it is rarely mutual. Her exit also carried a sobering statistic. She was reportedly the 11th communications professional to leave within 5 years. 11. For any organization, that level of turnover would trigger alarm bells. For a brand built on narrative control, it signaled something far more serious. Agencies and recruiters began whispering warnings. The phrase, difficult clients, surfaced repeatedly. Reputation, once damaged, spreads quickly in tight professional circles. At some point, insiders argue, patterns become impossible to ignore. 1 or 2 departures can be coincidence. 11 is culture. And with each exit, the Sussex brand's ability to attract and retain top talent diminishes further. As the list of departures grew longer, a clearer picture of life inside Archewell began to emerge. Former staffers describe an atmosphere that was both chaotic and constricting, where autonomy was promised publicly but rarely granted internally. According to multiple accounts, decision-making authority was tightly centralized, with even minor details subject to scrutiny and revision. Professionals hired for their expertise reportedly found themselves sidelined, reduced to executing instructions rather than shaping strategy. One recurring complaint centered on constantly shifting expectations. Projects launched with urgency were abruptly deprioritized. Goals moved without explanation. Timelines were compressed, then extended, then abandoned altogether. When outcomes failed to meet expectations, blame flowed downward. Successes were claimed collectively. Failures were individualized. For many, the emotional toll became unsustainable. Sources allege that Megan, in particular, maintained an intense hands-on approach, often intervening in areas outside her advisor's professional domains. Insiders questioned why seasoned experts were hired only to be micromanaged. Trust, they say, was in short supply. Feedback loops functioned in one direction only. Dissent was discouraged, sometimes interpreted as disloyalty. Harry's role, according to former associates, was more inconsistent but no less impactful. He could be deeply engaged one moment and entirely absent the next. Initiatives he championed passionately could lose his interest overnight. Staffers were left scrambling to reconcile conflicting directives. The result was an environment where long-term planning became nearly impossible. Recruiters soon took notice. Candidates were warned discreetly. Questions about turnover dominated preliminary conversations. Even generous compensation could not offset reputational risk. In creative and communications fields, word travels fast. Once an organization is labeled high churn, attracting talent becomes exponentially harder. What made the situation more baffling was Meghan's own background. Before royal life, she invested heavily in cultivating her public image, understanding better than most the power of strategic messaging. Observers struggled to reconcile that awareness with the apparent inability to delegate. Harry, meanwhile, entered the marriage with a carefully curated public persona, crafted by palace professionals. That goodwill evaporated quickly once the protective structure was removed. As more insiders spoke out, a troubling theme emerged. Accountability rarely traveled upward. Each controversy generated internal frustration, yet reflection at the top was reportedly absent. When projects faltered, explanations focused on execution rather than conception. Over time, morale eroded. By the time Meredith left, the damage was already done. The exits were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a system that repelled the very people it depended on. And as staff continued to flee, a far more consequential shift was quietly unfolding behind the scenes. Buried within the announcements surrounding staff departures was a technical detail that initially escaped broader attention but quickly raised red flags among nonprofit experts. Archewell, it was revealed, was transitioning to a fiscal sponsor operating model. To the uninitiated, the phrase sounded benign, even strategic, but to those familiar with the nonprofit world, it suggested something far more concerning. Under a fiscal sponsorship arrangement, much of the operational responsibility is transferred to an external organization. Donations are processed elsewhere. Administration, compliance, and program management are handled by third parties. The original entity retains branding, visibility, and credit, but relinquishes day-to-day control. In practice, it is often used by startups lacking infrastructure or by organizations seeking to wind down quietly. Critics were quick to interpret the move as a retreat. After years of emphasizing hands-on impact and independence, the Sussexes appeared to be outsourcing the very work that defined their mission. Insiders suggested the shift offered maximum visibility with minimal responsibility. Photo opportunities remained. Awards remained. The labor vanished. The timing made the optics worse. Just weeks earlier, the couple had accepted accolades for their humanitarian efforts, delivering speeches about commitment and service. Behind the scenes, staff layoffs were already in motion. Programs once touted as cornerstones now faced uncertain futures. Who would manage outreach? Who would coordinate partnerships? With a skeletal team, answers were scarce. Experts pointed out that such transitions often signal financial strain or strategic disengagement. Either the organization could no longer sustain itself, or its founders no longer wished to. Neither interpretation inspired confidence. For supporters and donors, transparency became a growing concern. The contradiction was stark. The Sussexes had framed their departure from royal life as a quest for autonomy and meaningful work. Yet here they were, stepping back from operational responsibility entirely. Independence had led not to innovation, but to delegation. For observers, the move symbolized a broader pattern. Vision statements abounded. Execution faltered. The gap between rhetoric and reality widened. And as Archewell's structure thinned, questions multiplied about sustainability, credibility, and long-term intent. As organizational changes accelerated, attention inevitably turned to finances. Maintaining a high-profile lifestyle in California is expensive under the best circumstances. Property taxes, security, staffing, and upkeep quickly compound. According to estimates, the monthly burn rate alone would strain many successful enterprises. Yet expected revenue streams failed to materialize at projected levels. Streaming deals, once hailed as transformative, produced mixed results. Initial interest faded. Projects underperformed. Partnerships dissolved quietly. A podcast deal collapsed after limited output. Lifestyle ventures stumbled at launch, generating more mockery than momentum. Speaking engagements became sporadic. Against this backdrop, staff reductions took on a new meaning. These were not efficiency measures. They were cost controls. Corporate language softened the reality, but the math was unforgiving. When expenses outpace income, cuts follow. What unsettled critics most was the juxtaposition of layoffs with public-facing charity events. Employees smiled for cameras at volunteer outings, unaware that their roles might soon disappear. The optics were jarring. Loyalty appeared transactional. Service performative. Financial pressure also explained Harry's increasingly scattered solo appearances. From real estate conferences to surprise international visits, opportunities seemed pursued opportunistically rather than strategically. The impression was one of hustle, not cohesion. Hollywood noticed. Associations cooled. Invitations dwindled. In entertainment, perception drives opportunity. A brand perceived as unstable repels collaboration. And stability, once lost, is difficult to regain. When the Sussexes first arrived in California, the welcome was enthusiastic. Doors opened. Contracts followed. They were embraced as symbols of reinvention. But that goodwill proved fragile. As projects faltered and controversies mounted, enthusiasm waned. Executives reportedly grew frustrated. Deliverables lagged. Expectations went unmet. Public relations could open doors, but substance had to sustain them. According to insiders, it often did not. Celebrity friendships cooled. Invitations slowed. Association became risk rather than reward. In an industry allergic to failure, distance is instinctive. Meghan's attempts at reinvention met diminishing returns. Fashion appearances generated ridicule. Brand alignments raised eyebrows. Harry, meanwhile, retreated further from entertainment altogether, his public persona shifting from charming to aggrieved. Agencies began advising caution. The calculation was simple: little upside, considerable downside. And once that narrative takes hold, recovery is uphill. As professional ventures unraveled, scrutiny intensified around the marriage itself. Patterns familiar to celebrity watchers began to emerge. Joint projects dissolved. Public schedules diverged. Appearances together became less frequent. Harry maintained separate communications, teams abroad. Meghan focused on domestic branding efforts. Their paths increasingly ran parallel rather than intertwined. Speculation mounted. While no formal steps were evident, structural changes suggested preparation. Shared ventures were simplified, assets streamlined. Observers noted that such moves often precede significant personal shifts. The performative nature of public affection drew skepticism. Displays appeared timed for cameras. Off-camera dynamics reportedly differed. Whether the marriage endures remains unknown, but the architecture supporting it has undeniably changed. As the dust settles, the picture is stark. Archewell, once envisioned as a global force, now resembles a shell. Staff gone. Operations outsourced. Purpose diluted. Harry's trajectory appears increasingly independent. Meghan faces the challenge of reinvention without novelty. The royal family watches silently, its absence of response speaking volumes. Silence denies conflict. Without opposition, victimhood narratives collapse. The institution carries on. The contrast is unmistakable. What remains is a cautionary tale. Ambition without structure. Vision without follow-through. Freedom without responsibility. The staff exodus was not the cause of the collapse. It was the proof. The coming year is shaping up to be even more volatile for the Sussexes. Financial strain is unlikely to ease as lucrative deals continue to thin out and expectations from major partners grow sharper. The Montecito estate may soon become more than just a backdrop for headlines, fueling the separation rumors that never truly disappear. Streaming platforms will expect results, not promises, and patience in Hollywood is famously short. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the royal family will remain quietly observant, offering no commentary as events unfold exactly as they have. What once looked like a modern fairy tale has hardened into something far less flattering. A story defined by overreach, miscalculation, and the limits of reinvention. Harry and Meghan set out to prove they could succeed entirely on their own terms. What they have shown instead is how fragile that independence can be. Share your thoughts below, hit like, subscribe, and don't go anywhere. The next chapter is already unfolding.